What is up, ladies and gents, Noli here, and welcome back to another Payday 2 video. Today we're going to be talking about threat, probably the most frequently misunderstood and confused stats in the game. In this video I'll discuss how it's calculated, how it works, and some useful applications, hopefully by the end simplifying what is on paper actually a relatively complex mechanic. Without further ado, let's get into it. Threat's a statistic that is not set and averaged out over your entire build like detection risk, but instead is applied to your individual weapons like accuracy or stability would be. This means it's unique to whatever weapon you have out at the time, so it's something you may have to think about a little more if you're trying to leverage it. Switching to a high threat weapon in a heavy assault can make quite a big difference. Let's first look at how a weapon's threat is calculated because it's a little more confusing than you might initially expect. The threat table looks something like this. So if a weapon, let's use the M60 for this example, starts with 34 threat, and then gets 25 taken off that by the bigger the better suppressor, its total threat will obviously be 9. What may confuse you when trying to maximize threat is that further additions or subtractions are not calculated on top of each other. So for example, here I throw the Tropical Foregrip on my M60, which has a plus 9 to threat, yet instead of getting 18 overall threat, it goes to only 11. A bit of a rip-off, right? But this can be explained. It's because all calculations are made at base threat level. So if you watch the table, from 34 the plus 9 moves it 2 spaces to the right to 43, and the minus 25 moves it 12 spaces to the left. This means 12 minus 2, we see 10 total tiers of threat movement to the left from 34, so final threat equals 11. In other words, the total effect is based on the sum of the overall differences, explaining why I only get plus 2 from my seemingly plus 9 modification. This is a little bit confusing and tends to be more of an issue for high base threat weapons. If you have a lower threat pistol, for example, it's actually possible to leverage this effect to gain more threat than what the numbers would suggest. Just keep it in mind and don't worry too much about it. So what does threat actually mean? Well, like many of your other stats, its effect on gameplay is created based on an effect chart which takes the visible stat and converts it into a tangible effect that we don't see numerically. Here I call this suppression. Threat ranges between 0 and 43, and if a weapon has a threat level of 0, it will create a suppressive effect of 2, whereas weapons with a maximum threat level, so 43, will result in 45 units of suppression. The numerical details are not really that important, and there isn't a sweet spot here, so just know that more threat is generally a good thing. Now, how is suppression applied by weapons? Simply put, by shooting at them. By shooting in the direction of an enemy, even if said enemy is behind cover, you will apply points of suppression with active effects that occur once certain breakpoints are reached. So, as you can imagine, the higher your weapon's threat is, the faster the effect will be applied. The proximity of shots to the enemy will also affect the total buildup. Oddly, aiming further away from the enemy within the angle of possible suppression is best for this. It's quite a complex formula, so if you're particularly interested, take a look at the appendix of the Payday 2 long guide, linked down below. The initial suppression breakpoint will cause enemies to duck down and lose about 50% accuracy and shoot less frequently. The second and final breakpoint will cause them to abandon their pathing and find cover, ignoring the player until cover is reached. Keep in mind suppression values do not decay over time, but are reset after they are applied, with the cop gaining a 50% resistance to future suppression attempts for 30 seconds. Weapon threat does not increase the duration of the suppression, which is randomized within an interval that depends on the power level of the enemy. So for example, a blue SWAT would be under the effect for longer than a tan. Also, the higher the level of an enemy, the more threat applications required to actually suppress them. All special enemies cannot be suppressed outside of snipers, which is why it's often better to shoot in their direction rather than just running past them, even if you have little hope of hitting them. Now we know what it does and how it's calculated, let's just touch on some common misconceptions, which I personally totally understand as it's really not that clear what it does, especially for new players. First, I've heard people suggest that high threat can be a bad thing as it gives you enemy focused priority. This is not the case at all. If you want to be the center of attention, the muscle perk deck has what you need for that. Threat also has no application for dominating enemies easier or earlier, something I often hear suggested and believed myself for a while. It's also got no impact on civilian control and keeping them down. For that you need something like the skill Stockholm Syndrome, which works great with the Silent Saw in stealth. Finally, Threat and the Saw is a bit of an odd one. The Saw has some unique sociopath-like effects that people think are dictated by Threat and Suppression. That's not the case at all. Only damage dealt by the Saw will create any sort of crowd control effect. Finally, let's mention some Threat applications. Suppression is probably most useful for weapons with accuracy over range problems. LMGs, for example, may struggle to hit over distance, but can lay down pretty effective suppressing fire given their high base threat values and fire rate. Especially against snipers, who often cause so many issues for LMG builds, forcing them to shoot less frequently and less accuracy can be huge. For pinpoint accurate weapons, Threat is a wasted stat, as every bullet landed will apply full suppression to that enemy if it doesn't kill them, so don't even worry about it. The weapons which probably apply suppression best are shotguns, especially with low accuracy. This is because their suppression will always use the ideal trajectory without spread considered. One of the more unique threat applications is using it in stealth. This can force stationary guards to cower, covering their headboxes, which are what actually spot the player. It can also be used to lock them in place. This can be really nicely leveraged on a heist like Art Gallery, where the front door guard can be a real pain, as you see here. And that does it for this video. Let me know if you learned anything and if you find this sort of video useful. For those of you excited about episode 2 of my Payday lore and story series, I've started scripting work already and I'm expected to drop it within the next week and a half, so stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching this video, stick around on the channel if you enjoyed, and I'll hopefully see you all very soon.